They say you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And so while we're looking forward to the next fantasy baseball season, I think it's appropriate to take a look back at the history of fantasy baseball. And well, I think we have just a guy to help us with that. It's the guy who literally wrote the book on the history of fantasy sports, and that is author Larry Schechter, who you may know because he wrote the book on how to win in fantasy baseball. That's right, winning fantasy baseball. And both books are available right now. You go to Amazon or any major book seller. So, first of all, big thank you, Larry, for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. It took a lot to get me here when there's an NFL game on, but it's the Patriots, so I'm not missing much.
Yeah, no, I know, and that's the thing. I'm transitioning. Like I just did a fantasy football Q&A for our other channel, and it's still football season, although it's not much longer. I think we're ready. I'm ready to transition to baseball mode. Starting to get into it. But the great
Yeah,
thing is, there's never a bad time to plan for
yeah,
baseball because there's so much to get into, right? There's so much that goes into it all. Um,
yeah.
so I want to ask you. The first thing is, you wrote a book, correct me if I'm wrong. It's been about 10 years. Winning fantasy baseball with Ron Chandler, who, by the way, now that I've finished your book, which very interesting, especially to me. So now I have to move on to Ron's because I got the baseball forecaster here, and that's an annual read, checking up on how to win in fantasy for this year. So you wrote a book on how to win and play in fantasy baseball, and you've done a lot of winning. And according to your bio, and you can see this is on Amazon. You began playing fantasy baseball in 1992. You won the CDM Sports National Salary Cap Challenge. You've won a lot. You are now in major expert leagues like Labor and Tout Wars. And for those who don't know, that's the cream of the crop. It's not easy just to get into those leagues, much less to play and win in them. What made you want to write a book on the history of fantasy sports, looking back, when you had already been a published author? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I did publish Winning Fantasy Baseball in 2014, and after that, I once in a while asked myself if I had any other ideas I thought would be worthy of a book, and this was the only idea I ever had that was any good because I would look at the industry, fantasy sports, where it started years ago with ideas for games people had, and it's grown into this humongous worldwide thing. You got millions and millions of people playing everything from fantasy football and fantasy baseball to fantasy wakeboarding, fantasy Iditarod, cricket. It's worldwide. It's a $25 billion a year industry. You have news services, stat services, Sirius XM radio, 24/7 fantasy channel. When you watch a game on TV, they're talking about fantasy statistics. So I just have wondered, like, where did this all come from? How did this happen? Nobody has ever written a book like this or explained how this happened. So that's where the idea came from, and I decided to do it. Finally, about more than 2 years ago, I started, and I had no idea what I was getting into. I thought it was something I could knock out in 3 or 4 months. That was crazy wrong. It took 18 months of full-time work, researching, interviewing dozens and dozens of people, and of course, writing. And then since that 18 months to get the manuscript done, it's been more time getting the book published, promoting it. So it's been like a full-time job for more than 2 years now. So everybody has to buy the book because I don't want this 2 year full-time effort wasted. I mean, I did it as a contribution to the fantasy community because nobody's ever done this, and
Right.
it's needed. It was needed. The reviews are fantastic. People are saying it's easy to read. It's fascinating. And the thing is, when I'm giving a very long answer to your one question. I ask one question, I'll just talk for the whole hour. Um, when I started it, the idea was write the history of fantasy sports. How did it happen? Who did what when? Um, but when I started researching and talking to people, I started hearing fascinating stories about what people had done. They were just interesting, fascinating. Some were inspirational. Some will bring a tear to your eye. Lots of humorous anecdotes. So I realized early on I can write the history of fantasy sports, who did what when, and it'll get the job done, but it'll also come off as a very boring research paper. But instead, by weaving through the stories of what people did, it's made it really interesting and easy to read instead of boring. Yeah, so that's it. I'll stop talking now. I'll let you ask another question.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to unpack, and I will say, like you said, it's a very easy read. I mean, it's interesting to me just because of someone who has been, to some extent, in the industry and knowing a lot of the names that are in there. I mean, I found it fascinating, but like you said, it's not as simple as people think. So if you watch, especially if you've seen the Ken Burns documentary in baseball, or if you've heard the story, that the myth is Daniel Okrent one day was sitting having lunch with his buddies, and they're like, "Hey, let's invent fantasy baseball," and then we made the rules, and that was it. And then from then, it just it's not that simple. It wasn't one person, one thing. It's there's so many different ways that so many different things that contributed to it. So it's a lot more complex than people probably realize.
Yeah, the other myth is that Dan Okrent magically came up with the idea on a plane flight from Connecticut to Texas.
Right.
Not true at all. There's like a whole lot more to the story. It goes back 20 years before that. He is the person mainly responsible for creating or inventing modern fantasy baseball, at least the auction format. But there are lots of people that were playing primitive versions before he ever came along. The thing is, the people that were playing these other versions, they kept it amongst themselves. The thing with Okrent is, number one, the game Okrent invented, which was originally called rotisserie baseball, it was like inventing chess compared to everybody else playing checkers. And number two, Okrent was an editor and a writer, and the people he got into his first league were all in the publishing industry, writers, editors, whatever. So they ended up getting publicity. There were some articles written in the New York Times and elsewhere. They got on the Today Show, and so that spread the game. They got publicity. People found out about the game. That started to spread it. They got a book published in 1984, Bantam Books. Lots of people read that book, started to play fantasy baseball. And Ron Chandler, who you mentioned before, I mean, Ron Chandler is one of the people who got started because he saw that book. Matthew Berry, when he was 14 years old, started playing rotisserie because he saw that book. Chandler's interesting. Chandler, he got the book in I guess it was like the late summer or something like that. And he was like, whoa, this is great. I got to play this game. But it was like the late summer, too late. So what he did is he got some friends together, and they started a fantasy hockey league. They just took the rotisserie rules for baseball, and they, took that as a model to make up some rules and have a fantasy hockey league that fall. And then the next spring they did the fantasy baseball.
A similar experience, because baseball is my first love, the first sport I ever started watching. It's the one that I, of course, analyze and do now for this channel and along with football. But the first fantasy sport I remember playing in high school was football, because football being, again, I'm from Miami. This was back when the Dolphins were actually fairly good for a consistent time with Dan Marino and all that. It was easy to follow. It was the most popular sport. But the second sport I ever played was fantasy hockey. And again, it was goals and assists. It was simple. It had some people who liked hockey. There was no hockey team in South Florida at that time, but it was just, you can play fantasy with almost anything. And these days it's super easy. So it's interesting. That's almost like a slippery slope, right? Once you get involved in one, you see how addicting it could be.
Right. And yeah, Peter Shankey of RotoWire says if it has statistics, you can make a fantasy game out of it.
Yep.
And in the book, my book starts with the precursors to fantasy sports, then the invention and spread of fantasy football, the invention and spread of fantasy baseball, the first commercial games, the first books, magazines, radio shows, TV shows, Fantasy Sports Trade Association, news services, stat services. It covers everything through more modern times like daily fantasy sports. I also have a list of all the games that I've learned, that I heard of in all the research. Every time I heard of some game that people play fantasy, I made a note. So, in one place in the book, I have a list. Like, this is everything, all the fantasy games I've heard of. I'm sure there's more that I haven't heard of, but there's more than 50 games in that list. I mentioned some of them before. There's others, like there's fantasy sumo wrestling. There's fantasy Congress, where you pick you pick congressmen, you can pick, people in the Senate or the House of Representatives. Like, we could have a draft. I'll take Ted Cruz. You take a Alexandria, what's her name? AOC. You take AOC. I take Ted Cruz. I take Marco Rubio. And then we get points. If they sponsor a bill, we get points. If they speak on the floor of the House or the Senate, we get points. If they vote against their own party on any vote, you get bonus points.
Ooh, now that would make it
So
interesting.
that makes somebody like Ted Manchin really valuable, I suppose. I never thought this through, but it just occurred to me Ted Manchin would be really valuable voting against his party sometimes.
Wow, that would make it really interesting if I had any interest in following the news these days or politics.
Yeah, well, that's not like an incredibly. There aren't like millions of people playing that game, but right. It's actually the woman who started it. It's actually her biggest amount of people playing it are like high school civics classes.
That makes sense. That does make sense.
Yeah. Yes, it does.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm a teacher by day, when a fantasy analyst by every other time. I'm all into the gamification of things because, again, this is how kids see it as the challenge, right? The reward system, the points. So that kind of leads me to the logical question here is, why are so many people, especially now, into fantasy sports? Because, I think as baseball fans, it's the stats, right? A lot of people love baseball because they love following the stats. Why you like the baseball cards? You stare and you memorize the stats, and you're just into the numbers. But not everybody who plays fantasy is into stats and numbers. They want something more simple, especially on the football side. And we see this all the time. People are asking just very basic questions like, who do you feel better about, Joe Burrow or Baker Mayfield? And it's not even an analytical thing. So why is it that you think fantasy sports or fantasy whatever is so engaging to so many people?
I don't profess to have the answer to this question, but, I would say people like sports, they like competition. In fantasy, you get to choose your own players, make decisions. Harsh Jain, who's the head of the Dream 11, which is a large cricket company in India. Well, yeah, I mean, it's a fantasy company in India whose biggest game is cricket. He says that fantasy is like getting popcorn at the movies. The movie's good, but popcorn makes it even better.
Makes sense.
And here, since I brought him up, I got to tell you something that if you haven't heard it, it'll blow your mind. And most people haven't heard it. I hadn't heard it until I was researching. Now, a lot of people have heard there are 50 million people who play fantasy sports in the United States. And that's age 18 and up. It doesn't even count age 18 and under. So 50 million, that's a lot of people, obviously. But guess how many people play fantasy cricket in India? 200 million.
Wow. Just in India.
Dream 11 is worth $8 billion, that company.
But I believe it. And, that's the one thing. We look at the explosion of fantasy football, especially in baseball. We don't even realize the biggest sport globally, it's not one of our Americans, but it's soccer. Americans just aren't as good at it. But if you want to play the true football, fantasy football, I wish I knew more about it, but that's global and that's worldwide. And that's.
Lots of people play fantasy soccer. I'll call it soccer to distinguish. But they call it football. But a lot of people play it in Europe and South America. A lot of people in the U.S. play it too, but it's really big in Europe and South America.
Yeah, I mean, there's still so much potential out there. All right, so the thing I want to know, I think the most, is from the stories that you have here, and again, it goes through all the different types, the first games, right? The news outlets, divide between the biggest contributors. I mean, there's just so much to it. What's something that, regardless of the sport, the era, whatever, that you've noticed from like you said, dozens, I wouldn't be surprised if over 100 people you talk to, what's something that you notice that they all have in common?
The biggest thing they had in common is like I go through the history and how things started and were created. So it's really a lot of stories about entrepreneurs who created something for the industry. And um, so the thing they had in common is they saw a need for something that didn't exist or something that existed, but they thought they could do better. So that's what they have in common. They were entrepreneurs. Like, for example, Ian Allen and Bruce Taylor were college students at the University of Washington, and they played fantasy. They got introduced to fantasy football. They played it for a year. They thought, oh, this is great, but there's no information available. Let's start a magazine. And they started a magazine when they're in college, and it's Fantasy Football Index, which is still around, but like 30 or so years later, it's one of the very biggest fantasy football magazines. And it's like the same thing. People, when computers started, to come around, people realized like, hey, I could use a computer to do statistics for fantasy sports, whereas before then, the commissioner or somebody had to do all the stats by hand, which would take several hours every week. So the first computer people that applied it to fantasy sports, they're like, they saw like this would be great for fantasy sports, and they created companies and did that. And like one example, Jim and Gloria Berger were a couple from Pennsylvania. They started one of the first fantasy sports stat services for baseball and football in the 80s. And what they would do is for baseball, you get the USA Today. Tuesday had the American League statistics for the week. Wednesday had the National League statistics. So Gloria would read the statistics, Jim would type them in the computer, they'd print out the reports, mail them to their customers on Wednesday night. So that's kind of like when I talk about like the history of fantasy sports, that's like the history. But then when I talked about the stories of people that makes it more interesting, I'm going to get to that next, which is one Wednesday, Gloria went into labor with her first child. And they didn't let a little thing like going into labor stop them from doing their job. So in between contractions, Gloria read the statistics to Jim. And then she'd be like, wait, hold on, here comes another one. Oh, okay, it's gone. And she'd continue. So in between contractions, they got it all done. They got the reports out on time Wednesday night. And their daughter was born that day. And now, 37 years later, that daughter that was born that day plays in the fantasy football league with her dad.
Wow. That's like you said, it's dedication. I think love for this sport, but also that spirit of doing something, right? Creating something. Because what you talk about is people who created these platforms that now some of which are still going. So that's amazing. I'll tell you what, in my experience, and I'm fortunate because even right now I'm strictly a YouTuber and that takes up enough time. But for several years, I was lucky. I wrote for a website called rotoballer.com. I was lead editor, and I was able to go to the FSTA convention one year. And I was fortunate. And so I know for me, it's a little bit of a geek trip because a lot of the names in here that people might not know, like I know these names, a lot of them at least. I got to meet Greg Ambrosius, Nando DeFino, the Athletic, Scott Fish. Scott Fish actually knows my name, and I've meeting him a couple times. Great guy, and all these people, they're just good people. I mean, honestly, I don't think there's anybody I met, and people it's not about building a business so I can make money. It's not just that. It's about making community. It's about, involving people in something that they love. They want to share it. So I can say that because I've seen that firsthand. And it's true. Everybody that I was fortunate to meet, I actually got to, shake hands with Matthew Berry and meet a lot of great people. And for a lot of people, they're just like, this might be a bunch of names and sites and things from the past, but to me, it was really cool to see all that.
Yeah. And there's also lots of names in my book you've never heard of,
Right.
And like I had never heard of. And even like Paul Charchian was the president of the FSTA for 12 years. He's been in the industry his entire life. He read the book and he said, like, wow, I didn't even know some of this stuff.
Wow.
Yeah. It's like nobody like that. And one thing back to the entrepreneurs that saw, they saw a need for something that hadn't been done, or they thought they could do it better. Um, One thing that was really cool for me is when I finished the manuscript and I sent it off to my editor. One of the editor's comments was I should have an epilogue. I did not originally have an epilogue, so he said, it doesn't have to be long. Just something to kind of recap, tie it all up. So I thought, okay, that's a good idea. I should do that. So I started thinking about what do I want to write for the epilogue. And when I was thinking about it, it occurred to me, I just did the same thing all these entrepreneurs did. I saw a need for something that didn't exist, and I created it.
Well, there you go.
And that was cool.
That is cool. Got a full circle moment there.
Yeah.
It's true. And I'm glad you did that, because a lot of people just take for granted it's just always been there, right? You get on Yahoo or ESPN and you play fantasy, and they don't realize the struggle that it was to have to wait until Monday the newspaper came out and go through the stat and the box scores. And if it was a late game, it wouldn't be in there if you had the early edition, and it wasn't always that simple. But with that said, I'm going to ask you now, being in the industry for so long, do you think it's better now just because we have so many options? It's so automated. I mean, everything it's easier, of course. Did you appreciate it more? Do you feel like it was better for you as a player when it was more, I don't know, pure, I guess?
Well, as a player, I mean, I think the technology has made it much better. To be able to do to be able to make your moves online and see the scoring in real time, is really not, things like that are really nice. You used to have to, I mean, when I started playing, and I started in like early 90s, so I wasn't even like one of the earliest, but I had to call in a number with my moves. There was no internet. The reports would show up in my mail like 3 or 4 days later after the week had ended. So I would have an idea of how my team did, but I wouldn't really know exactly where I was in the standings or anything until the mail showed up in 3 or 4 days. So now, I mean, the technology has made it, so much easier to play. And it used to be, you would get your reports in the mail. Then with computers and the internet, you could maybe go online and get the results maybe a day later. And then it became, it would update every hour, and then it became like every second. If somebody throws a touchdown pass right now, it's on your computer. In fact, sometimes the results even, what can I say? There's a delay. I mean, sometimes with TV games, there's like a little 7-second delay. So like sometimes I'll see the result online, and then the play happens on my TV.
Yeah, I hate that.
Yeah. I hate that too, but that's like, yeah, the technology is incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully, I feel like people, this is going to sound like a, old man rant, but it's like, you don't appreciate what it was like when we had to do it the old school way. But
Right.
I get it. You know what you're used to. Um, but so with that said, I have a question now. As far as all of the different contributors, and I don't mean individually as far as person, is there one particular type of game, like for example, some of the ones you mentioned, like national pastime, ballpark baseball, or even Stratomatic? Would you say that there's one or two that you feel like were the most influential, most similar to today's version of fantasy baseball, or is really just a true amalgamation of everything?
Well, the difference with those games, like take Stratomatic, for example, and Appo, which is really similar, they're based on professional athletes' real performance, but it's for prior seasons. So you could buy a Stratomatic game today based on last year's baseball season or last year's football season, or you could even get it from 5 years ago. Whereas, as you know, the fantasy we're talking about, you pick players before the events occur. So you draft your football team in August, and then the season starts in September, and you don't know what's going to happen yet. So that's the difference between the fantasy sports we're talking about compared to like a Stratomatic or National Pastime or other games like that. But they've been very influential. I mean, Stratomatic appears throughout my book. When before I started writing, before I started researching, I thought, some people consider games like Stratomatic a precursor to fantasy sports. So I thought, well, I'll probably mention this, like probably 2 or 3 paragraphs about Stratomatic APA, kind of like what some people consider a precursor. When I started researching, I was like, holy crap, there's so much interesting stuff about this. Like there are people that have played in APA and Stratomatic leagues for years. They started in high school or college and they're still going 50 years later. There's a guy who was in one of these APA leagues for many, many years. In 2018, he was diagnosed with ALS. Everybody, including him, thought he would have to stop playing. But his wife said, if you want to keep playing APA, I'll do whatever I have to do so you can keep playing. So she went to the games with him. She would roll the dice. He would tell her what moves to make. And the third year of doing this, his condition kept deteriorating. By the third year, he could only communicate through an eye reader and a computer, and his wife could read his lips. And in that condition, his team came from 2 runs behind in extra innings to win his first ever APA World Series championship after 39 years in the league.
Wow.
And everybody broke out into tears.
I can imagine, but that's a great example of just, again, the love of the game, right? This is one of those things that, is a motivational tool. And, people play for a lot of different reasons, but yeah, that's a great example.
One other thing about Stratomatic, which people for the most part, don't know, and again, I didn't know this either. Dan Okrent, credited with inventing fantasy baseball, he invented the stat whip. The baseball stat whip was his invention, and where he got the idea from was he played Stratomatic. Before inventing rotisserie baseball, he played Stratomatic, and Stratomatic has a fatigue rating, and that's where he got the idea for whip.
And a lot of people don't realize whip was not a commonly used fantasy baseball stat. I mean, I don't want to say recently. It's been probably a couple of decades, but when I first started playing, a whip wasn't used, right? It was walks, saves, ERA, strikeouts. That was it. But whip has become just normalized.
And when people started playing too, they could only use the statistics that were published in the newspaper.
Exactly.
So Okrent, again, this reminds me of another Okrent thing. Okrent was, really, really early on. Okrent realized on base percentage was a better statistic than batting average, but he couldn't use it for fantasy because it wasn't published in the papers back then.
Yep.
And there was a league. I believe, if I remember correctly, I think it was the USA Today had like an office league, and they wanted to use something. I think it was like caught stealing. They wanted to use, and that was not published in the paper. But since it was the USA Today, they had the ability to say, okay, we're going to start publishing this in the paper so we can use it for our fantasy league.
There you go. And there's a lot of examples of that where the fantasy industry then influences the media. And of course, you see it now all the time, ESPN, all the major broadcast platforms.
Yeah.
So now I can ask you about one thing that, as far as I know, unless I missed it, was not in your book. So my real introduction to online fantasy baseball was a site called Small World Fantasy Sports. Do you remember that? Do you know anything about that? Because I know that they were active. It was the mid 90s, and then they lasted a few years and then went out of business, or they changed their name or something. But I remember it was a salary cap sport, but it was very unique because it was like a stock market type of thing where if more people buy into a player, their price would go up, and then vice versa. Do you remember that one?
I don't think I ever heard of that one. Yeah, there was a game that is in my book called Wall Street Sports, And that was not a fantasy baseball or football game, but it used athletes' performance like a stock market thing. Like they would have, like for Mark McGwire, they would say the analysts project Mark McGwire is going to hit 45 home runs and 145 RBIs, and people could buy or sell his stock. And if Mark McGwire played tomorrow night and hit 3 home runs, his stock price would undoubtedly go up because he'd be more likely to hit that projection. Um, and they had this for like baseball players, football players, hockey, and basketball. So like during the summer, everybody would own all baseball players, and then as the other sports, when you get into the fall now, people are buying basketball and football players as well. And they oh, and they had golf players too. Actually, there was golf also because they said Freddie Couples one year was leading the Masters, and on the 13th hole or something, he hit the ball in the water. Like the final day of the Masters, he's leading. It's the 13th hole. He knocks the ball in the water, and his stock price crashed immediately. And the guys said when that happened, they knew they were onto something good. They knew they were going to be successful, and they saw it. He hits the ball in the water, and the stock price crashes.
That's funny. Yeah. Reactionary, I think is a good way to put it. What a lot of fantasy players are, a guy gets.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, in the real stock market, if I own IBM and news comes out, IBM just lost their biggest contract or they're under federal investigation for something they did, the price is going to go down or, the earnings report. I mean, the companies come out with an earnings report all the time and the stock goes up or down.
True. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, the one thing that I remember what ruined it for Small World, why they probably went under, because even back then and before even social media is, there were still message boards and things. There basically was a group that figured out, hey, if we can all say we're going to buy this one player who was like, I don't know, it was like $100 was the cheapest, some guy who doesn't even play. Like, we're all going to buy in on this one, and then he's going to shoot his price up, and then we're all going to sell. And it kind of got corrupted, you know what I mean? For the collusion.
There was a flaw in that idea, and their game had a flaw. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't a fail safe back then, but it was fun and it got me into full-time fantasy baseball sports. Okay, so I have 2 more questions. I'm going to put you on the spot here. First of all, with all the fantasy options, like you already mentioned before, and I'm guessing more of a baseball guy, but you're talking football here. You're ready to watch the game. What's the best fantasy sport of them all?
The best is whatever you're playing. Whatever you like. I mean, that's an individual question. I like football and baseball. Now, football is the most popular in the United States. That's for sure. And cricket's the most popular in India. Soccer is the most popular in a lot of Europe and South America. But that's an individual question. Some people, like one or the other. I mean, I think you got to start with liking the sport. I mean, like I barely watch any hockey, so I'm never going to play fantasy hockey. But I like I watch baseball, football anyway. So yeah, this is whatever sport you like, I guess.
All right. And that's because I think it's odd. Again, for me, I like all sports. I played fantasy baseball, football, hockey, basketball. I tried soccer, even though I didn't know a lot about it. And so I think it's always odd to me when we have people on the football like, oh, baseball sucks. I can watch baseball. There's too long. It's too many stats. And then the baseball crowd, it's the opposite, right? They're like, football is so simple and, you have nothing to dig into. So I don't know. I think you can like both, but I don't know. Some people don't feel that way, but everyone's different. All right. And then finally, I know you've won a lot of leagues and I assume you're still in the labor and the tout wars and those major leagues. How many copies of your book do I need to buy for you to get me into tout wars? How many? Just tell me. How can you get me
in? I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay. All right.
I'll have to make a few phone calls and see if I can bribe anybody.
Okay. There you go. Let's make it happen. Okay. I don't know if I would be able to hang with those guys.
one of the chapters in my book is about the experts leagues. You mentioned Scott Fish before.
Yep.
Created the fishbowl. Justin Mason, who created the Great Fantasy Baseball Invitational, which is
Yep.
a great thing that he created. He did that. The story's in my book, but one of the main reasons he did that is he was kind of jealous of the people who were in labor and tout wars, and he wished he could get in labor and tout wars. And he never, he thought, my chances of getting in, they're pretty slim. So he creates this Great Fantasy Baseball Invitational idea. And before the first season even started, he got invited into tout wars. So it's like, at first, his first reaction was like, I didn't need to do this. And then the second reaction was, well, this is a good thing anyway, and this will give a chance for other people, besides me that, didn't get into labor and tout wars. So it turned out to be a great thing that he invented.
Yeah, it's a great thing, and Justin, I'm lucky. I have been in TGFBI since year one. I was able to win in 2020. I was a little bummed because I was actually at one point number one overall heading into the last week of the season, and I slipped from 1 to 3rd, and then I guess I didn't make the right waiver moves the last week of the season. I finished 12th overall, but I still won my league. But I love TGFBI because it's a bigger version of that, but also just like the Fishbowl, I know they do it for charity, so it's a great cause. Fantasy Cares. Yeah. I've been in the Fishbowl for I think 8 years, and I never seem to do too well because the rules change every year, and it's always a little hard because you're swimming with sharks, and that's my problem these days. Is now almost all my leagues are expert leagues, and so I find I don't win quite as often, but it's still more fun. So
yeah.
All right, well, Larry, thank you so much for being on here. And again, anybody who hasn't checked it out, the history of fantasy sports, you don't have to have been around and been playing fantasy sports since the inception in the 90s, the 2000s. It's really interesting to learn the stories. These people, again, probably a lot of people don't realize just how much has changed, or also how much went into making it what it is now. So it's really interesting. And also, you can still get Winning Fantasy Baseball. Larry, do you have any plans for any other books in the near future?
No, I don't. I think this is it. But a lot of people have read the history of fantasy sports and loved it that never played fantasy sports before, because it's not about how to play or the strategy. It's about the stories of the people. So you don't even have to play. Like the Midwest Book Review said, fascinating from start to finish. And that was by somebody who's never played fantasy sports. So I encourage everybody to get it. If you're busy right now, just buy it and read it when you have time. Most major booksellers have it, paperback and ebook. Amazon is easy to get it. Amazon's where you get a lot of details, read lots of reviews if you want to. And you can get it for all your league mates. See, something like Winning Fantasy Baseball, you don't want to give that to your league mates because you want to keep that strategy to yourself. If you find something like RotoWire or Football Guys or something you think is like really giving you really valuable information, strategy, you don't want to share that with your league mates. But the history of fantasy sports, you can buy a copy for all your league mates as a gift.
There you go. Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, it's just
yeah. So Eric Kesselman, he sent me an email like a few months ago. He said, "Hey, I got your book. I'm on page 30. I already bought 2 more copies for friends of mine."
Perfect. There you go. Yeah, and exactly. Like, it was very interesting for me, having played for a couple of decades, but also knowing some of the people in here and knowing the names, or at least being familiar with a lot of them. You don't have to be. You don't have to be. And it's interesting, not just from a fantasy sports fan, just like you said, the entrepreneurship and the history of it all. So it's very interesting. So again, definitely recommend it. Thanks again, Larry. And those of you who still are playing fantasy baseball, assume you are here, you want to know how to win for this coming year, subscribe. I always tell our viewers, you know what? You don't have to share what I say with your league mates, but share with everybody else. Hit the subscribe button.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.